All right. We forgot to give the intro. You're off the hook. Okay, next time. We're ready.
So this book is called I Won't Learn From You by Herbert Cole. I Won't Learn From You and Other Thoughts on Creative Maladjustment. And so my purpose in reading and presenting on this book is to understand the reasons why students resist learning and to develop a personalized teaching ideology for myself to better understand what I believe about teaching and why I believe what I believe about teaching and what I believe about students. So, enter. Okay, alright, so roadmap, where we're going, we just want to talk about his life, important keywords within his book, what other thinkers say, standards that are related to his book, what I would do in my own classroom, when I disagree with them, and how he's changed my thinking. So this is him, Herbert Cole. He's kind of an old man now. He grew up in a Jewish family in the Bronx. His grandparents spoke Yiddish, and he attended Hebrew school as a boy. So he grew up in a very protective, the minority was the majority in his neighborhood. He described it as a ghetto, but when he got to Harvard, and he studied at all these colleges, when he got to Harvard, Harvard was still all male, predominantly white and Protestant. So he was the minority when he got to Harvard, and I think that experience had a lot to do with his 20 books that he wrote for the rest of his career. These 20 books dealt with the education of marginalized and disadvantaged students. He has taught from kindergarten all the way to grad school, and he draws on personal stories when writing the book. So, because he understood what it felt like to be a member of a minority race and a minority culture, he lived in the middle of McCarthyism, and in his Jewish community, socialism had been something socially accepted. But then, Red Scare, he grew up in a world that was hostile, a largely conformist, 1950s suburban world. And so he worked from a place of deep compassion to aid and understand children often set aside and labeled as at risk. So, so he grew up in a minority. This is my school, from high school. We are 98% white. It was a private school. You had to pay money to go, so lots of doctors' kids in middle-class homes. Pretty vanilla. And then this is my town. So I'm from Hattiesburg, and we have a urban school, an inner city school called Hattiesburg High, and we have a suburban, more white, more wealthy school called Oak Grove. And so Hattiesburg High, so 96% members of a minority race, and 89% economically disadvantaged, lots of kids on government-funded lunch, and then in Oak Grove, it's 43% minority and 42% economically disadvantaged. So just huge disparagement between the two schools. White kids, white families do not normally send their children to Hattiesburg High. My boyfriend went to Hattiesburg High, and so it's always interesting to hear how he was treated differently as a white student than his black classmates were treated. And and then what I thought was interesting was the AP test. Same amount of kids taking the AP test, but 6% passed from Hattiesburg High and 23% passed. No, 77% passed from Oak Grove. So huge difference. The big words in Cole's book are not learning and creative maladjustment. So not learning is when a child is able to learn, perfectly capable, but chooses not to learn. And the reasons for choosing not to learn can be when someone has to deal with unavoidable challenges to his or her personal and family loyalties, integrity, or identity. So if the child feels excluded by what their teacher is teaching them, if they feel discriminated against, or if they don't see the use in learning what their teachers are trying to teach, then they can shut down and actively refuse to learn. And it's important to be able to recognize that in your students and not just assume that someone is dumb even when they refuse to do their homework or refuse to understand. And then creative maladjustment, this was developed by, he took this idea from Martin Luther King, and it was an idea of how to resist orders from your authorities when you believe that your personal values are compromised, but how to be able to how to be able to survive with minimal and moral personal compromise even when your world asks you to compromise. So what this had to do with Cole's life, in his life he refused to learn the Yiddish that his grandparents spoke because his mother didn't speak Yiddish and he didn't want to be exclusive towards his mother. And then he refused to learn Hebrew because he just thought that would take too much trouble. Even though he went to Hebrew school, he actively shut down his brain and chose not to learn Hebrew. And though eventually he regretted choosing not to learn 2 other languages that he had lots of access to, the fact that he chose not to learn helped him understand students that he taught in the future. And this is important for us as future teachers because we need to know like how to teach in a way that honors every student. We need to teach in a way that includes other cultures and makes each student feel valued, because we do not want to shut down students and make them resistant towards learning. And talking more about creative maladjustment, when Cole was a student teacher, he was let go 2 weeks before his student teaching was up because he couldn't obey like his authorities. Like he believed strongly that the way he was teaching was right, and he wanted to take care of his students, but at the risk of he got terminated before he was done with student teaching. So it ended up okay. He got to spend the last 2 weeks somewhere else, but he took this very seriously, but became more discerning and wise and careful about it as he matured. And then so for us, we need to know what our values are and what we're not willing to compromise on as teachers. And comparing Cole to other thinkers, I just want to focus on these 2. So these are from the readings on my courses, and so this statistic says that teachers immediately judge students on class differences in appearance and behavior. They put more privileged students at a table of fast learners and less privileged students at a table of slow learners. And I just thought that was a really cool connection to this quote from Cole when he says that many students become accustomed to being treated as objects by people who control their access to higher learning, and too often these young people just give up on their aspirations. So for us, we have a lot of power in our students' learning, and we, in some senses, control their access to higher learning. And how can we make sure that we don't stigmatize and sectionalize students off in our classroom and project expectations upon them before we've even gotten to know them on a personal level. These are just some standards that are related to Cole's book. They all have to do with diversity. This one has to do with if your student's first language is not English, how to incorporate their first language into your curriculum, how to explore other worldviews and include culturally diverse text. So this is my mantra after reading this book. It's within my own classroom. I hope to establish personal relationships with each of my students. I hope to earn their trust and lead open discussions about relevant and even controversial topics. I hope to ensure that each of my students feels valued, no matter his or her background or resistance to learning. And ways you can do this in an English classroom are you can read books from authors all across the spectrum. You can read Maya Angelou and Richard Wright. You don't have to just focus on Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of a slave or whatever. You can focus not just on stories of suffering and oppression, but you can focus on stories of being lifted up and Zora Neale Hurston and discovering life in the Harlem Renaissance. So you can read lots of different books from different authors, and then the English classroom is super conducive to discussion groups, and so how to talk about race and themes of race and literature, and ask students to write about what they have experienced. In my high school, we had this project where we wrote a bunch of essays about our story, our past, our friends, what we believed, and you can ask your students to do the same thing. Help them to discover themselves and discover their own identity. And then for myself, I think it would be really helpful to ask to not teach advanced students. I think I would gravitate towards students that would be easy to teach, and I think it would be helpful for me to choose to teach a more challenging class and see what that teaches me about myself and about other people, and then also just watch for students that put their head down, that don't do their homework, and try to find out why they are resistant to learning, and don't assume that they don't want to learn or don't care. Things that I disagree with Cole's book, he's very anti-labels, and I agree with where he's coming from, but I think that labels are sometimes useful when we need to describe students. We need to have a vocabulary as teachers so we can talk to each other and figure out how best to help students. And so when we can't use words to say, this is what this student is struggling with, this student is at risk, then I think that can be harmful. And then sometimes he can take creative maladjustment too far with a not learning principle. Sometimes I do believe that students should be asked to learn things that they don't want to learn. Just because he had a story of a child that really just wanted to play saxophone, but that child still needs to learn how to read and how to do math to function as a member of society. And also, he just told a story of a community that sent hate mail to a racist principal, and he just kind of seemed supportive of that form of creative maladjustment, and I wasn't sure that, I just kind of felt like hate mail was taking it too far. And then, how do you know when you're supposed to dislike? When is too much compromise too much compromise? How can you discern between the times when it is morally acceptable to creatively maladjust and times when conformity is necessary? And ways this affected my thinking, I thought this was so cool. So he taught a college level education class, and the kids came in, college kids came in, and he asked them to write about a positive experience that they had had with learning and a negative experience that they had had with learning. And each time, the good learning experiences involved a teacher who had gone out of his or her way to support, challenge, or befriend, or encourage that student as an individual. And so the kids, the college kids, knew what made a good teacher because they could see it in their life, and that was often what had made them want to become a teacher. But so then Cole begins to formulate the class around discussion, and he doesn't give out a syllabus, he doesn't create a lot of structure because he wants them to talk about what makes a good teacher. But they get anxious because their whole lives they have been following structure, and they want predictability, regularity, and class rankings. They want to know how to pass the test. They don't want to be challenged in their thinking because they're so used to school being a certain way. And so he said that students wanted to know what the right answers were, and I wanted to talk about the questions. And so for myself, confession, in this class, when I came in the first day, I was so anxious because I wanted a syllabus right away, and it looked like we were going to talk a lot, and I wanted to know like when the tests were and how to make a study guide. And so in ourselves, when we talk about good teachers, we should recognize like our own latent beliefs that we don't even realize that we have about how school should be, and those are anyway. Yes. Okay. And then also changes in my own thinking. I have observed in classrooms where I have been too quick to stigmatize students, but I've also observed classrooms where the teacher was too quick to tear down students and too quick to pronounce someone as dumb. Or I watched it in a second grade classroom last year, just for fun. Anyway, and the teacher told me that she thought one of the students was just going to grow up to be a stripper, and I just thought that was such a dark pronouncement to speak over someone's life at second grade. And then I also have never really thought about how history textbooks can be exclusive to races. How like language can be sexist. And I also never really thought about what my personal philosophy was and what I would do if a principal asked me to do something that compromised my beliefs. And these are where all my pictures come from. That's it.
Round of applause. Questions. Let me stop this thing.
So how did he